recognized a Palestinian state, with French President Emmanuel Macron hosting today's two-state solution summit. Macron has announced France's intention to recognize Palestine in July, confirming it to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, sparking anger in Israel and the United States. Several world leaders are expected to formally recognize a Palestinian state at a summit in New York, including Denmark being among the countries taking this step, while Israel warns and considers possible West Bank annexation, and it moves on with its barrage into Gaza. Iran's atomic energy chief and Vice President Mohammad Eslami have arrived in Moscow for talks, according to the Iranian embassy in Russia. This visit comes after the UN Security Council refused to permanently lift sanctions, with 3 European countries seeking to reimpose them over alleged violations of the 2015 nuclear deal. Russia has asked the UN Civil Aviation Agency to ease sanctions on aircraft spare parts and overflights, calling Western restrictions unlawful coercive measures. The sanctions have cut off Russian airlines from direct access to parts for more than 700 Airbus and Boeing jets, forcing them to rely on complex indirect import routes. U.S. lawmakers held their first House of Representatives visit to Beijing in 6 years, meeting Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun to discuss strengthening military-to-military communications. The bipartisan delegation led by Democratic Representative Adam Smith comes after Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping agreed to further talks. Russia has offered to extend nuclear warhead limits under its treaty with the United States for 1 year after the agreement expires in February 2026. The move comes as renewed global concerns over nuclear arms control hover. Egyptian President Sisi has issued a pardon for prominent activist Alaa Abdel Fattah, a 43-year-old British Egyptian who has spent most of the past decade in Egyptian prison. Alongside 5 others, the move follows international pressure, including from the United Nations and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Super Typhoon Ragasa has hit northern Philippines with winds of 215 km per hour and gusts up to 295 km per hour, prompting President to order full alert across government agencies. The storm has triggered suspensions of classes, work, and canceled 24 domestic flights, halted ferry services, and raised risks of floods, landslides, and storm surges over 3 meters. The 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly opens this week in New York, marking 8 decades since its founding, with the theme Better Together, 80 years and more for peace, development, and human rights. High-level week begins with leaders, heads of state and government set to reflect on the United Nations' past achievements and map a path forward on critical issues. The general debate kicks off Tuesday, September 23rd, running through September 29th. Key concerns on the agenda include worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the ongoing war in Ukraine, climate action, gender equality, and questions over multilateral reform. Leaders from all around the world are expected also to address concerns about funding, institutional capacity, and global cooperation at a time of mounting global instability. Now, for this discussion, we are joined by Raymond Vickery. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce, joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Raymond. Good to see you. Now, looking at this, how might this year's UN General Assembly address growing calls for multilateral reform to better respond to global crises like the wars in Gaza and Ukraine?
Indeed, an important meeting of the 80th anniversary, which comes on the heels of the worst violation of the UN Charter against invasion and taking over by force neighbors that has occurred in the 80-year history. And I, of course, refer to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, what has happened is that at a time when the United Nations could be a great instrument for waging peace and prosperity, the Trump administration is basically withdrawing from the United Nations work. It's already withdrawn from the WTO, from UNESCO, from the Human Rights Organization of the UN, and has cut funding across the board for the Food and Agricultural Organization, the relief of refugees, and basically has downgraded any approach to international multi-level action on peace and prosperity. And what is happening, of course, is that authoritarian governments like China are moving in to take advantage of this Trump administration withdrawal and to try to control the agenda and what happens from here on. You throw into the mix the Trump administration clamped down on visas for such representatives as those from the Palestine organizations. You have the clash over whether to recognize Palestine as a state, and it is both a landmark and a very disconcerting session of the General Assembly at this time.
And what do you think, Raymond, in what ways can world leaders use the 80th UNGA session to strengthen international cooperation on urgent issues, but knowing, and you've also mentioned that US is maybe not actively pursuing it, nor Israel is present in this. Israel and US is boycotting the, not UNGA, but Gaza and Palestinian issue two-state solution that is hosted by Saudi Arabia and France.
Well, first of all, the opportunity for UN reform, as you indicated in a previous question, should not be passed up. Nations such as India, who were not world powers at that time, the global south needs to have more representation, particularly in regard to the Security Council. And then a way has to be found around this absolute veto situation which we have now in the Security Council. This basically has hamstrung the United Nations from taking effective action in regard to such conflicts as that in Gaza, in Ukraine, and across the board. So yes, there's an opportunity here for reform and broadening, but at the same time, without the United States stepping forward as a leader of the free world contingent and providing funding, it is very, very difficult to see how the United Nations becomes anything more than a forum for the putting forward of authoritarian views such as those from China. So it is a difficult time. There is an apparatus, there is a way forward, but unless there is some change in regard to leadership, in regard to how the United Nations can move forward, it is going to continue to fade in significance for building world peace and prosperity.
Right. With that, thank you very much, Raymond, for always joining us and sharing that insight. Now we move on to our next news. Now, France and Saudi Arabia are hosting a one-day summit at the United Nations aimed at reviving the long-stalled two-state solution as international recognition of Palestine builds momentum. The event held ahead of the UN General Assembly comes just a day after the UK, Canada, Australia, and Portugal formally recognized a Palestinian state. France is expected to follow suit, while Belgium and other countries are considering similar steps. Israel and the United States are boycotting the summit, with Israel's ambassador dismissing it as a circus. The meeting is expected to expand on the earlier New York declaration, which outlined time-bound measures towards two states, condemned Hamas, and called for a ceasefire and humanitarian aid into Gaza. Now, for this discussion, we're joined by Jordan Cope. He's a Middle East expert, joins us live from Dallas. Thank you very much, Jordan, for joining us. Good to see you. Now, what concrete outcomes or commitments are expected from this France-Saudi Arabia-led summit, and how might they reinvigorate efforts towards two-state solution?
The success of the two-state solution ultimately depends on the international community and reviving it. And it should be known that previous international agreements already stipulate that the Palestinian Authority cannot enter into agreements with other international countries until the pathway for the Oslo Accords and the interim agreements have been fulfilled. These countries are actually helping the Palestinian Authority violate the Oslo Accords and the interim agreements. And it should be noted that treaties under international law hold the highest weight under international law, and these countries are actually foregoing basic international legal principles and trying to force a two-state solution without demanding the Palestinian Authority to fulfill their obligations under the Oslo Accords. The US Supreme Court recently ruled as well that that the Palestinian Authority is not a country under international law. And one of the foremost legal principles to use is the Montevideo Convention to assess whether a country has reached statehood. And out of the four conditions under the Montevideo Convention, the Palestinian Authority is currently lacking two. So one has to, I guess, second guess France's motives in trying to advance a two-state solution right now, which is a horrible precedent as Israeli hostages continue to be held under the tunnels of Gaza, approximately 50 to date. It is a reward for terrorism since October 7th. Both Britain and France, their leadership has faced significant unpopular, unfavorable ratings. And France itself has been pushing this, despite the reports within France saying that the motive for doing this is not necessarily to advance peace in the region, but rather to suppress growing dissent at home with France's extremist elements of its own communities. It's a terrible precedent. It rewards terror, and it doesn't demand the Palestinian Authority to reform any bit whatsoever in a territory where it doesn't even fully control.
Right. Thank you very much, Jordan, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion. Now, our anchor and correspondent, Thomas Porteous, will be in New York to bring you all the live updates from the 80th anniversary session of the United Nations General Assembly. Stay tuned. Now we move on to our next news. Speaking at Russia's Security Council meeting, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that he's ready to extend the last remaining arms control treaty with the US, but only if Washington agrees. The New START treaty, which limits the number of strategic nuclear weapons each side can deploy, is set to expire on February 5th, 2026. Putin has also said that he's willing to extend the current treaty by 1 year and stick to its limits, but only if the US does the same. He added that Russia would reassess its position after that based on how the situation develops. Let's listen into what the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said.
В результате ранее предпринятых странами Запада достаточно разрушительных шагов был существенно подорван фундамент конструктивных отношений и практического взаимодействия между государствами, обладающими ядерным оружием. Оказались расшатанными основы для ведения диалога в соответствующих двусторонних и многосторонних форматах. Шаг за шагом была практически полностью демонтирована система советско-американских и российско-американских соглашений по контролю над ракетно-ядерными и стратегическими, копившиеся в стратегической сфере с начала 21 века, связываем с деструктивными действиями Запада, их дестабилизирующими доктринальными концепциями и военно-техническими программами, нацеленными на подрыв глобального паритета, на попытку обретения абсолютного подавляющего.
Now for this discussion, we're joined by John Rosamondo. He's the president of Viking Research Associates and geopolitical analyst, joins us live from DC. Thank you, John, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now thank you. Now looking at this, how might Putin's conditional offer to extend the treaty by just 1 year influence future arms control negotiations between US and Russia?
Well, going back to the first Trump administration, the Russians under Putin aren't terribly enthusiastic about any sort of like real deal. The first administration wanted to ban tactical nuclear weapons in addition to the strategic nuclear weapons. We're talking the kinds of nukes that everybody's talking about threatening Ukraine, which Putin has not been terribly concerned about. At the same time, the prior Trump administration was trying to loop in China because China has the largest arms that are outside of any treaty limits.
And John, how is this Putin's, do you think that there should be any other country that should be also included if they are to extend this treaty?
Well, absolutely. I think the Chinese should be looped in, considering they have the largest stockpile of intermediate range ballistic missiles. Their nuclear program is slated to have over 1,000 warheads within 5 to 10 years, up from about 200 warheads, which, we went through a Cold War based on the arms race, and it looks like the arms race is back on.
And now, what are the potential global security risks if the New START treaty expires without mutual agreement between US and Russia?
Well, I think that, if it expires, we'll face, no treaty restrictions or no formal restrictions. However, that has never stopped the Russians from developing their technologies and their nuclear weapons, in contrast with the U.S. That has a largely aged nuclear triad.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we move on. A delegation of U.S. lawmakers has met with senior Chinese leadership, including Defense Minister Dong Jun, in the first House of Representatives visit to Beijing in 6 years. The delegation has met with Chinese Vice Premier He Lai-feng as well. These talks are aimed at bolstering exchanges, including military-to-military communication. The bipartisan delegation was led by Democratic U.S. Representative Adam Smith, the current top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee that oversees the U.S. Defense Department and armed forces. According to China's state-run news agency, Defense Minister Dong has urged the lawmakers to eliminate interfering and restrictive factors and adopt constructive and pragmatic measures to help improve military-to-military relations and bilateral ties. Now we go back to John Rosamondo for this discussion. Thank you very much, John, for staying with us. Now, what are the potential geopolitical implications of this involving a mix of U.S. And China's shared military-to-military cooperation?
Well, I think that, it's crucial to have communication between two countries that are opposed to each other, like we had during the first Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, because it allows the nations to avoid going to a shooting war. It also offers an opportunity to maintain dialogue so that you don't have tensions escalating out of control.
And what do you think, what can China and U.S. do, or do they have any mutual ground to start with, looking at their rising tensions between them and their not particularly good relations right now?
Well, I think that anything that keeps the Chinese from perceiving American aggression or vice versa is a good way to avoid, starting a war. I mean, misunderstandings have led to countless wars over the millennium.
Right. Thank you very much, John, for joining us today and sharing that insight throughout our news. Now we move on to our next news. Senior White House officials say President Trump will sign an executive order later this week declaring the sale meets all legal requirements under the 2024 law. The administration confirms that enforcement will be paused while the deal finalizes. Oracle and Silver Lake are among the investors, though the full list is still being finalized. Officials say it will include a mix of U.S. and global firms. Oracle will provide security and be allowed to study TikTok's algorithm. The U.S. government will not take equity, appoint board members, or seek a golden share. Trump has made clear that he wants patriotic investors who bring long-term value. Officials estimate the deal could generate hundreds of billions in economic activity over the next 5 years. Now for this discussion, we are joined by William Yang. He's an analyst at International Crisis Group, joins us live from Taipei. Thank you very much, William, for joining us again. Good to see you. Now, what are the potential economic and geopolitical implications of involving a mix of U.S. and global investors in the TikTok deal under this new 2024 law?
I believe the decision to include also global firms is probably a compromise that both the Chinese and the American side reached ultimately, because I think we need to remember that from the Chinese perspective, giving the U.S. complete control over the fate and the algorithm and the core of TikTok is not really acceptable based on the Chinese law, which is exactly what the Chinese Commerce Ministry laid out in one of their latest statements over the weekend. So I believe that by including global investors to be involved with the future operation and the managing of TikTok is, from the Chinese perspective, a acceptable solution. And from the U.S. perspective, they can guarantee that the American investors that are going to be involved in the operation of TikTok will likely play the main role of managing the future direction of this app going forward.
And William, how might allowing Oracle to study TikTok's algorithm address U.S.'s national security concerns without requiring government control?
So I think we all know that Oracle's founder has a very close relationship with Donald Trump. And at the same time, Oracle does have a sizable operation inside China. So for a company like Oracle to play a role in studying the Chinese algorithm based on the White House officials' statement would, in fact, I think, be an acceptable solution for both the American side and the Chinese side, because I think from the Trump White House perspective, by involving a company that has a deep personal relationship with President Trump himself, then that, I think, adds a layer of comfort, but also trust between the president himself and also the larger congressional, environment, and also the group that are likely going to have potential concerns. And I think at the same time, for the Chinese side, Oracle is, I think, a company that they trust enough that they believe sharing more sensitive data from like the algorithm that is behind TikTok is not going to completely harm their interest as well. So I think, again, this reflects the outcome of a consensus that both sides are able to reach. And I think it, in fact, is probably going to help inject some positive momentum into the overall larger bilateral trade negotiation and engagement going forward.
And building on your answer that U.S. government seems to trust Oracle in large, does this U.S. government's handling of the TikTok sale reflect a fair and consistent approach to foreign-owned tech companies, or does it set a precedent for politically motivated intervention in private businesses?
I wouldn't say intervention is the right word. I would say clearly when it comes to foreign acquisition, especially if it involves a very important Chinese company, then there would certainly be a layer of preference based on the specific company's owner's personal relationship with President Trump. And that would probably be an important factor for the administration to determine which companies would fit the profile of a ideal candidate to actually play important roles in acquiring or taking over the main ownership of operation of a Chinese company that might be similar to the case of TikTok going forward.
American companies' access to TikTok's algorithm without taking accountability. Is the U.S. prioritizing economic interests over genuine national security concerns? What do you think?
That is definitely very clear. I think from the ongoing trade negotiation to the particular details that have emerged from the TikTok case, we can all see that President Trump personally believes that business and economic interests should be prioritized in any major trade negotiations, and national security concerns or considerations shouldn't come in the way of his government trying to sign or reach landmark or important trade or economic deals from their perspective.
Right. Thank you very much, William, for joining us today and sharing your insight as an analyst at International Crisis Group. Now we move on to our next news. Northwestern Italy is facing heavy flooding as autumn storms battered the region. An orange alert was issued yesterday for parts of Lombardy and Liguria, with torrential rains hitting Milan since last night. Up to 80 millimeters of rain fell in Paderno, Dugnano, causing the Seveso River to overflow and flood neighborhoods in northern Milan. The Lambro River is also at dangerous levels, and water has emerged from manholes on key roads, prompting installation of flood barriers. The Bormida Valley experienced landslides and flooding, leading to school closures throughout Liguria, except in Imperia. Floods have even reached the Palace of Justice in Milan, forcing power cuts and suspension of all activities. Milan Civil Protection Councillor Marco Granelli has urged residents to exercise maximum caution. Firefighters have responded to over 70 emergencies since the storm began, working to secure affected areas. This is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.